3 days after we buried my father, my brother and sister read his will in the good living room of the house I grew up in, and they did it without me. I found out because I arrived early to help clean up after the reception. Still in the only suit I own, the one I'd bought for our mother's funeral 8 years before, and I walked into the house and found the three of them, my brother Preston, my sister Vivian, and our younger brother Chase, sitting around the dining table with a lawyer I'd never met and a stack of papers, and they went quiet the way people go quiet when the person they were just discussing walks into the room. And Preston, my eldest brother, the successful one, the one who wears his contempt for me like cologne, looked up and said without a trace of shame, "Oh, Eli, we didn't expect you this early. We were just handling the will. Don't worry. There's nothing in it for you to worry about." And then, because Preston has never in his life been able to resist twisting the knife once it's in, he slid a small cardboard box across the table toward me, and he said, "Dad left you this, his old fishing tackle and his watch. He knew you'd appreciate the sentimental stuff more than money you'd just waste anyway." My sister smirked, and I stood there in my dead mother's funeral suit, holding a box of my father's fishing tackle, being told by my siblings that our father had cut me out of his will, 3 days after I'd held his hand while he died. Stay with me, because what my brother and sister did not know, what they could not have imagined as they smugly divided our father's house and his lumberyard and his accounts among themselves that afternoon, was that the will they were reading was not my father's real will, and that my father, who understood his children better than any of us ever understood him, had left the truth and everything that mattered with the one child he actually trusted. Me. My name is Eli Sutton. I am a carpenter. I build cabinets and stairs and the occasional whole house with my own hands in the same small town of Ashford where I was born, and for my entire adult life that fact has made me, in the eyes of my family, the failure, the disappointment, the one who never left, never made anything of himself, never became a lawyer like Preston or married money like Vivian or, well, Chase never really became anything either, but Chase at least had the decency to fail in a city, which apparently counts for more. Let me draw you my 3 siblings clearly, because you'll want to know exactly who was sitting at that table dividing our father's life. Preston, the eldest, is a corporate attorney in the city, and he is very good at it, and he has spent his entire adult life constructing an identity out of importance, the right suits, the right address, the right people, a man for whom the worst possible fate is to be seen as ordinary, which is precisely why the lumberyard and the flannel and the fishing cabin filled him with a shame he could never quite hide. Preston does not do anything without calculating what it gets him. He is the kind of man who remembers your birthday only if you're useful and who has never in my hearing admitted to being wrong about anything. Vivian, my sister, married a man named Charles Ashby from a family with what people in her world call old money, and she has spent 20 years trying to become worthy of it, remaking herself into someone unrecognizable from the girl who used to fall asleep in the lumberyard stockroom. A woman for whom appearances are not part of life but the whole of it, and who looked at our father's modesty and felt not love but embarrassment. And Chase, the baby, is the one I've always felt for even when he wronged me, because Chase never had a self of his own to stand on. He drifted from job to job and city to city and idea to idea, always looking for someone to tell him what to be, and the someone was always Preston, and Preston always told him to look down on me, and Chase always did, not out of real malice but out of the moral cowardice of a man who finds it easier to borrow an opinion than to form one. 3 siblings, 3 different ways of being lost, and the one thing they all shared was the certainty, absorbed young and never once questioned, that I was the failure and that our father, being a sensible man, must secretly think so too. They were wrong about the second part in a way they could not have imagined, and it was going to cost them everything, and the reason it was going to cost them everything is that not one of them had ever bothered to actually know the man whose estate they were so eager to divide. I want to tell you the whole of this story, from the box of fishing tackle to the thing that happened 3 weeks later that changed everything, because I think there are a great many of us out there, the ones the family decided long ago were the losers, the overlooked, the ones seated at the far end of every table, and I think you deserve to know that sometimes the person who loved you most saw you most clearly, even when they couldn't say it, and left you proof if only you're patient enough to let it arrive. Let me tell you about my father, Gordon Sutton, because you cannot understand what he did unless you understand who he was, and almost no one, including his own children, ever really understood who he was. My father owned a lumberyard in Ashford. Sutton Lumber, on the edge of town, a modest place, nothing fancy, the kind of business a man runs in work boots with sawdust in his hair, And to everyone who knew him, my father was exactly that, a modest small-town businessman who did all right for himself, nothing more. He drove the same truck for 15 years. He wore flannel shirts until they went soft as tissue. He never took a vacation anywhere fancier than a fishing cabin 2 hours north. And my brother and sister, who fled Ashford for the city the moment they turned 18 and never looked back, carried with them their whole lives a slight, quiet embarrassment about where they came from, about the lumberyard and the flannel and the fishing cabin, and they assumed, because my father lived modestly, that there was modestly little to inherit. They were wrong. They were so wrong it would have been funny if it hadn't cost them everything. Because my father, behind the flannel and the 15-year-old truck, was one of the shrewdest quiet investors that town ever produced, and over 50 years he had turned a lumberyard into a fortune that none of his children, except one, ever knew existed. I knew because I was the one who was there. That is the whole hinge of this story, and it is the thing my siblings will never forgive, though they framed it for years as my failure. While Preston was in the city being important and Vivian was climbing into her husband's family's money and Chase was drifting from one thing to the next, I stayed in Ashford. I built my life there, and I spent time with my father, real time, thousands of hours of it, in the lumberyard on Saturdays and in that fishing cabin 2 hours north and on the porch of the house I grew up in, and my father and I talked, the way you only can when you're not in a hurry, when you're just two men who like each other's company and have nowhere else to be. My father taught me to fish and to build and to read a contract and to hold my tongue when holding my tongue was smarter than being right out loud. I want to give you one afternoon with my father so you understand what my siblings threw away. The inheritance they never even knew was the real one. I was maybe 30, and I'd taken on a job I wasn't sure I could handle, a big custom staircase for a house across the county, and I was scared I'd bitten off more than I could chew, and I drove out to the lumberyard on a Saturday to talk to my father about it. And my father didn't tell me whether to take the job. Instead, he took me into the back of the yard where the good hardwood was, and he ran his hand along a length of oak, and he said, "Eli, you know why I never sold this business and went and did something bigger? Everybody always thought I stayed small because I couldn't do more. Truth is I could have. I had chances." And he was quiet a moment, and then he said, "I stayed because I liked knowing every board in this yard, and every man who worked here, and every family in this town. I liked being the guy who knew the wood. There's a kind of man who always needs the next bigger thing, and he never actually lives anywhere, he's always halfway to somewhere else. And there's a kind of man who plants himself and goes deep instead of wide. The world tells you the first kind is the success. The world's wrong, son. At the end, the wide man's got a lot of everything and not much of anything. The deep man's got a life. I didn't fully understand it then. I understood it completely at his funeral, listening to Preston, the widest man I know, eulogize a father he'd never once gone deep enough to actually meet. My father was, without either of us knowing it, describing the exact difference between me and my siblings that afternoon in the lumberyard, and telling me, in his roundabout way, that the thing they'd all decided made me a failure was the very thing he most respected in me. I built that staircase, by the way. Still there. It'll outlast all of us. My father came to see it when it was done, and he didn't say much, he just ran his hand along the rail the way he'd run it along the oak, and he nodded, and that nod was worth more to me than every word Preston has ever said. And somewhere in all those thousands of hours, my father let me see the parts of himself that he showed no one else, including the fact that the modest man in flannel had, quietly, patiently, over decades, bought land all around Ashford when it was cheap, farmland and lots and acreage that everyone else overlooked, and had watched the town and the region grow toward that land until it was worth many, many times what he'd paid, and had put the proceeds, over the years, into investments he managed himself at the kitchen table with the same patient care he brought to everything. My father was worth, by the end, a great deal of money. Millions. And he wore flannel until it went soft as tissue, and he let his children believe he was a simple man, and only I knew the truth, because only I had bothered to stay close enough to be trusted with it. I want to be careful here, because I do not want you to think I stayed close to my father for the money. I did not know, for most of those years, the full size of what he had, and I did not care, and that, it turned out, was exactly the point, exactly the thing my father was watching for his whole life without any of us knowing he was watching. I stayed because he was my father and I loved him and I liked being near him. Preston and Vivian and Chase would tell you, if you asked them, that I stayed in Ashford because I lacked the ambition to leave, because I couldn't hack it anywhere real, and for a long time, I will be honest, a part of me half believed them, half carried the family's verdict on me as my own, the loser son, the one who never amounted to anything. It is a strange and heavy thing to be assigned the role of the failure in your own family, to have the people who are supposed to love you most decide, early and permanently, that you are the one who doesn't count. I carried that for decades. What I did not know, what my father never told me in life because he was saving it for a moment when it would land with the force of proof, was that he did not see me as the failure at all. He saw me as the only one of his 4 children who had turned out to be a person he could trust. And he had built, quietly, patiently, in his last years, a way to tell me so from beyond the grave, in a manner none of my siblings could argue with or twist or take away. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how my father died, and what he gave me before he did. First, though, a word about my mother, Carol, because she is woven through all of this and because the scholarship in her name is not incidental to the story, it is close to the heart of it. My mother was a schoolteacher in Ashford for 30 years, and she taught half the town to read, and she was the one who first understood me before my father did, understood that her 3rd child was not less than his siblings but simply different, that my quiet and my hands and my love of making things were not deficiencies to be corrected but a nature to be cherished. When Preston and Vivian mocked me as children for wanting to stay in the workshop instead of chasing whatever they were chasing, it was my mother who would put her hand on the back of my neck and say quietly just to me, "Never mind them, Eli. You've got your grandfather's hands and your grandfather's heart, and those built everything this family has. They just don't know it yet." She died before she could see how right she'd been, and that has always been my one great sorrow in this whole story, that my mother, who saw me first and clearest, did not live to watch my father's letter say out loud, to the whole family, the thing she'd been whispering to me since I was a boy. But I have come to believe that my father's letter was, in part, my mother speaking through him, because it was after she died that my father and I grew truly close in those 8 years of Saturdays and fishing trips, and I truly think that my father spent those years finishing the education my mother started, learning to see me the way she always had, and that when he wrote that letter he was, in a sense, catching up to his own wife, finally understanding what she'd known all along. When I funded the scholarship in her name, when I watched the first Ashford kid who couldn't afford college walk into one because of Carol Sutton, I felt, for the first time since she died, that my mother and I had finished something together. She taught me I wasn't the failure. I used my father's fortune to make sure her name would keep teaching that lesson to kids like me long after all of us are gone. My mother, Carol, died 8 years ago, and after that my father was alone in the house in Ashford, and I want you to notice something about those 8 years, because it matters enormously to what came later. In the 8 years my father lived alone as a widower, my brother Preston visited him a total of, I would estimate, 6 or 7 times, always briefly, always around a holiday, always with the air of a busy important man doing his duty. My sister Vivian called on Sundays sometimes when she remembered and visited perhaps twice a year, and spent those visits on her phone. Chase came when he needed money, which my father, being my father, always gave him and never mentioned. And I saw my father nearly every week for 8 years. I fixed things around his house. I took him fishing. I sat with him on the porch. When his health began to fail 2 years ago, I was the one who took him to his appointments, who learned his medications, who noticed when something was wrong. I did not do these things to be noticed or rewarded. I did them because he was my father and I loved him and there was nowhere I would rather have been. But my father noticed. My father noticed everything. And though I did not know it, my father was, in those last years, quietly making a decision about the true measure of each of his 4 children, and he was writing that decision down with a lawyer in a document that would one day speak louder than any of us. About 18 months before he died, on a gray autumn afternoon at the fishing cabin, my father did something I did not fully understand at the time. We were sitting on the dock, lines in the water, not catching anything, which was most of what fishing actually is, and my father was quiet for a long while, and then he said, without looking at me, "Eli, I need you to do something for me, and I need you to not ask too many questions about it, and I need you to promise me you'll do it exactly the way I say." And I said, "Of course, Dad, anything." And he reached into his coat and he took out a sealed envelope, a thick one, and a business card, and he handed them to me, and on the card was the name of a lawyer in the city, a man named Sol Abrams, whom I had never heard of because my father, it turned out, had kept his real legal affairs entirely separate from the small-town lawyer everyone in Ashford knew. And my father said, "When I'm gone, Things are going to happen fast. Your brother especially is going to move fast. And I want you to let them. Do you understand me? Whatever they do, whatever they say to you, however they treat you in those first days, I want you to say nothing. Don't fight. Don't argue. Don't defend yourself. Just let them show you exactly who they are. And then, when it's done, when they've shown you, you take this envelope to Sol Abrams and you do what he tells you. Not before. After. Promise me. I remember looking at my father on that dock, and I remember a chill going through me that had nothing to do with the autumn air, because I understood, dimly, that my father was telling me something about my own family, something he had known for a long time and was only now, at the end, preparing me for. And I said, "Dad, what is this? What's in the envelope?" And he almost smiled, that small dry smile of his, and he said, "It's the truth, Eli. It's just the truth waiting for the right time. Your whole life, this family's told you a story about who you are. I'm giving you the thing that tells the real one. But it only works if you let them tell their story first. You have to let them read the wrong one before I let you read the right one. Can you do that for your old man? Can you keep your mouth shut and let them hang themselves, so that when the truth comes it's undeniable?" And I promised him. I did not fully understand what I was promising. But I promised him, on that dock, with our lines in the water, and it turned out to be the most important promise I ever made, and the hardest to keep, because keeping it meant standing in my mother's funeral suit holding a box of fishing tackle while my siblings told me my father had left me nothing, and saying nothing and letting them believe they'd won. My father died 14 months later, on a Tuesday in spring, in his own bed, in the house he'd lived in for 50 years, with my hand in his. None of my siblings made it in time, though I called them all when the doctor told me it was close. Preston was in the middle of a deal. Vivian couldn't get a flight until the next day. Chase's phone went to voicemail. So it was just me at the end, the way it had been just me for most of the 8 years, and I held my father's hand and I told him I loved him and that I'd keep my promise, and he squeezed my hand once at the very end, and I have to believe that he heard me. And then he was gone, and I sat with him alone in that quiet house for a long time before I called anyone, because I knew that the moment I made the calls, my father would stop being my father and become an estate, and I wanted a few more minutes of him being my dad. I was right about that. The moment I made the calls, the machine started. My siblings descended on Ashford within a day, and from the moment they arrived, it was clear that they had already, somehow between themselves, decided how this was going to go. Preston took charge, as Preston always does, with the brisk authority of a man who has decided that his grief entitles him to control everything. And I watched, over the 3 days between my father's death and his funeral. As my siblings moved through the house I grew up in like assessors, like people taking inventory, opening drawers, examining things, murmuring to each other, and I said nothing, because I had promised my father I would say nothing. And it was the hardest thing I have ever done, harder than burying him, to watch my brother and sister Price my father's life while his body was barely cold, and to keep my mouth shut and to let them. I will give you one moment from those 3 days because it very nearly broke my promise, and I think it will tell you everything about what I was holding in. On the second day, I walked into my father's study to sit for a minute in his chair, just to be near where he'd been, and I found Preston at my father's desk with the drawers open, going through my father's papers with a legal pad, making notes, and on the desk beside him was my father's watch, our grandfather's watch actually, the one thing in that house with any real sentimental history, and Preston had set it apart, claimed, in a little pile of things he'd evidently decided were his. And I stood in the doorway and I said, quietly, because I could not entirely stop myself, "Dad's not even buried yet, Preston." And my brother looked up at me with the particular patience of a man explaining reality to a child, and he said, "Somebody has to handle things, Eli. That's always been the difference between us. While you were playing carpenter, some of us learned how the real world works. Why don't you go be useful and deal with the funeral home, and let the people who understand estates handle the estate?" And he went back to his legal pad, dismissing me, and I stood there with my father's last instruction ringing in my ears. Let them show you who they are, and I understood that my father had known with perfect precision, that this exact scene would happen, that Preston would be at that desk with those drawers open before the body was cold, and that the only thing for me to do was exactly what I was doing, which was to swallow it, and remember it, and wait. So I turned around and I went and I dealt with the funeral home, because someone who actually loved my father needed to make sure he was buried right, and I let Preston catalog the spoils and I said nothing, and it was acid in my throat the whole time. There was another moment, worse in a quieter way. On the third day, the day before the funeral, I overheard Vivian on the phone in the kitchen, not bothering to lower her voice because she did not consider me a person worth lowering her voice for, and she was talking to a friend, and she said, laughing lightly, "No, it's fine, it's actually not going to be that complicated. Preston's handling it. There's the house and the lumberyard and whatever Dad had in the bank, which knowing Dad won't be much. He was always so weird about money. We'll split it 3 ways and be done. 3 ways. Not 4. 3. My sister had already, before the will was even read, before our father was even in the ground, done the arithmetic that left me out entirely, and had done it so automatically, so much as a matter of course, that she said it out loud in a kitchen where I could hear, and it did not even occur to her that leaving her own brother out of the count might be the kind of thing you'd lower your voice about. I was not even a person to be cut out. I was a person who had never been counted in the first place. And I want you to understand that was the moment, standing in the hallway hearing my sister divide our father's estate 3 ways, that I finally, fully understood what my father had been protecting me from and protecting me with. He had seen this. He had seen it coming for years. And he had built me a door out of it, and all I had to do was keep my mouth shut long enough to walk through it. The funeral itself was the first place they made me understand my new position in the family now that our father, the only one who had ever taken my side, was gone. Preston gave the eulogy, and it was a fine eulogy, polished, the eulogy of a man who is good at speaking in public, and it was about a father I did not entirely recognize, a successful businessman and a patriarch and a man who valued achievement, which was Preston describing himself and calling it Dad. My name was mentioned once, in passing, in the list of surviving children after Preston and Vivian and before Chase, which is not even my birth order, and I understood that even in the ordering of a list I had been demoted. People from town came up to me afterward, the people who actually knew my father, the lumberyard men and the neighbors and the fishing buddies, and they held my hand and they said quietly, "Your dad loved you, Eli. You were the one who was there. He talked about you all the time." And my siblings did not hear those conversations because my siblings were accepting condolences from the important people, and I was off to the side with the flannel shirt people, the real ones, the ones who knew. That was the funeral. And 3 days later, they read the will without me and handed me a box of fishing tackle and told me I'd been left nothing. And I stood there and I kept my promise and I said nothing and I took the box and I went home. I want you to understand what that drive home was like because it was the lowest point of the whole thing, lower even than the hospital. And if you have ever had to swallow an injustice whole while holding your tongue, you will know exactly the taste of it. I drove the 20 minutes back to my house with that box on the passenger seat, my father's fishing tackle and his watch, the sentimental junk my brother had handed me like a man tossing a bone to a dog, and I gripped the wheel and I shook, not with sadness but with a fury I had nowhere to put, because I had promised my father I would say nothing, and I was keeping that promise, but keeping it meant driving away from my own family having just been told. 3 days after I buried the man I loved most in the world, that he had judged me worthless, and letting them believe I accepted it. Every part of me wanted to turn the car around. Every part of me wanted to march back in and tell Preston I knew about Sol Abrams. Tell them all that there was another will, wipe the smirks off their faces. And the only thing that stopped me, the only thing, was a promise made on a dock 2 years earlier to a man who had looked me in the eye and said, "Let them show you who they are. Then take this to Sol, not before, after." So I kept driving. I kept my mouth shut. I honored my father by trusting him even when trusting him felt like swallowing glass. And I want to tell anyone listening who is being asked to wait, to hold your fire, to trust that the truth will arrive in its own time, that it is one of the hardest things a person can be asked to do, and that it is sometimes exactly the right thing, and that the difference between the two is usually whether the person who asked you to wait had earned your trust. My father had earned mine across a lifetime. So I waited, and it turned out he was right, the way he was almost always right, and the waiting was the price of a vindication I could never have won by turning the car around. If you have listened this far, let me stop and ask you something, because it is the question I sat with that night, holding a box of my father's fishing tackle, and I need to know how you would have answered it. When your own family cuts you out, mocks you, tells you that the person who loved you decided you were worthless, and you are holding in your own home a sealed envelope that you believe contains the power to prove them all wrong. How long can you keep your mouth shut? How long can you let a lie stand, even knowing you hold the truth, even when speaking would end your humiliation in an instant? My father asked me to wait. to let them show themselves fully before I revealed anything. And every instinct in me, that night, screamed to drive to Preston's hotel and throw the envelope on the table and watch his face. Tell me in the comments whether you could have waited. Because I almost didn't. Stay with me, and I'll tell you what it cost me to keep my father's last promise, and what it bought. Let me tell you what I did that night instead of driving to Preston's hotel. I sat at my own kitchen table with my wife Sarah beside me, and I opened the box of fishing tackle because I wanted to touch the things my father had actually chosen to leave me, sentimental as Preston had sneered. And there, in the box, tucked under the tray where the lures sat, exactly where a careful man hides a thing he wants only the right person to find, was a second envelope, smaller than the one at the cabin, with my name on it in my father's handwriting. My siblings had handed me that box as an insult. They had not thought to look under the tray. Why would they? It was just the loser's sentimental junk. But my father had known with the eerie foresight of a man who understood his children completely, that they would give me the box as a slight and never think to search it, and he had used their own contempt as the hiding place for a message meant for me alone. I need you to sit with the genius and the sadness of that, both at once, because I have never gotten over it. My father, planning his own death, had looked at his children and calculated, correctly, that Preston and Vivian would be so certain of my worthlessness that they would hand me a box of sentimental junk as a deliberate insult, and that their contempt would be so complete that it would never once occur to them to look inside it for anything of value. And so he had chosen that exact box, that exact insult, as the safest possible hiding place for the most important message he would ever send me. He had weaponized their contempt against them. He had turned the very gesture meant to diminish me into the vehicle of my vindication. Only a man who understood his children all the way to the bottom could have planned that, and understanding your children all the way to the bottom and finding contempt down there in 3 of them is not a triumphant thing to understand. It is a lonely and grieving thing, and I felt, opening that second envelope, the full weight of how alone my father must have been with what he knew, for how many years, carrying the private knowledge of exactly who his children were and being unable to say it to anyone, planning quietly for the day after his death because the day after his death was the only time the truth could safely be told. I opened it with shaking hands, and inside was a letter in my father's hand, and it began, "Eli, if you're reading this, then it's happened the way I thought it would, and they've already shown you where you stand. I'm sorry, son. I'm sorry you had to feel that. But I needed them to do it, and I needed you to see it, and now I need you to trust me one more time. Go to Sol Abrams. It's time to read the real will." I read that letter 3 times at my kitchen table, and Sarah read it over my shoulder, and when I finished the 3rd time I put it down and I did something I had not done since my father died. Not at the hospital, not at the funeral, not through any of the 3 days of swallowing my siblings' contempt. I broke down completely, because up until that envelope, some cold part of me had almost believed them, had almost accepted that maybe my father really had judged me the failure, that maybe 50 years of the family verdict had been right and my father had simply agreed with it at the end, and that letter in my father's own hand, telling me he'd planned all of this because he loved me and trusted me and wanted the truth told, broke 50 years of doubt open all at once. Sarah held me while I came apart at our kitchen table, and she said, "He saw you, Eli. He always saw you." And I cried for my father, and I cried for all the years I'd carried the label, and I cried, most of all, with relief, the specific overwhelming relief of a man who learns, too late to say thank you but not too late to matter, that the person whose opinion he cared about most in all the world had believed in him the whole time that I drove to the city the next morning. I had not slept. Sarah came with me because Sarah has been the one steady thing in my life and because I did not trust myself to hear whatever I was about to hear alone. Sol Abrams's office was not what I expected. I had braced myself for the same kind of glass and chrome importance that Preston surrounded himself with, but Sol Abrams worked out of a modest suite in an older building, with worn leather chairs and shelves of actual books and the settled, unhurried air of a man who had been doing careful work for a long time and did not need to impress anyone. He was perhaps 75, small and sharp-eyed, and when his assistant showed us in, he stood and looked at me for a long moment with an expression I could not read, and then he said, "So you're Eli. I've been waiting to meet you for 2 years. Your father talked about you every time he came in. Sit down, son. Sit down. There is a great deal you need to understand, and your father wanted me to take my time explaining all of it, so we'll take our time. And then Sol Abrams poured me a cup of coffee with his own hands, and he sat down across from me, and he began to tell me the truth that my father had spent his last years building. Before he got to the documents, Sol Abrams told me about my father, the version of my father he'd known, and it was a gift I hadn't expected. He said my father had first come to him a little over 2 years earlier, and that he'd been struck immediately by the man, this quiet fellow in a flannel shirt who drove 2 hours to the city and turned out to have one of the most carefully organized financial lives Sol had seen in 50 years of practice. Your father, Sol said, was one of the smartest men I ever worked with, and one of the most private, and the two things went together. He'd figured out young that money makes people crazy, and he'd decided the only way to keep it from making his own family crazy was to never let them see it. And it worked, mostly, except for the part he couldn't control, which was that hiding the money meant his children never got the chance to prove they'd have been decent about it. That ate at him. He talked about it every time he came in. And then Sol Abrams looked at me carefully and said, "But mostly, Eli, he talked about you. Every single visit. He'd get the business done, and then he'd sit right where you're sitting, and he'd tell me some story about his son, the carpenter, the one who came every week, the one who took him fishing, the one who never once asked him for a dime. He was working something out across those 2 years, and I watched him work it out. He came in the first time thinking he had to be fair, split it 4 ways, do the expected thing. And somewhere in there, he stopped believing that fairness meant equal. He said to me once, I'll never forget it, he said, Sol, 3 of my kids would take the money and it would just make them more of what they already are. One of them would take the money and do good with it and it wouldn't change him at all. Why would I give it to the 3? Just because they came out of me too. Blood's not a reason. Character's a reason. And that's when I knew what he was going to do, and that's when he started building this. I sat there holding my coffee, and I understood that my father had spent the last 2 years of his life not just protecting a fortune but thinking, carefully, lovingly, about the true nature of each of his children, and coming slowly to a conclusion about me that he had never once said to my face, and I would have given anything to have heard him say even one of those stories out loud while he lived. The will my siblings had read, Sol explained, was real, in the sense that it was a genuine document my father had signed. But it was old. It was a will my father had made more than a decade earlier, back when my mother was still alive, a simple, standard will that split his estate more or less evenly among his 4 children. And it was the will that my father's old small-town lawyer had on file, the will everyone in Ashford would assume was operative, the will Preston had known about and rushed to probate. But my father had made a new will, 2 years ago, with Sol Abrams. A new will that revoked all previous wills, properly executed, properly witnessed, unimpeachable, and that new will told an entirely different story about who my father was and who he trusted, and it superseded the old one completely. My siblings had gathered around a table and read, with great satisfaction, a will that had been legally dead for 2 years, and they did not know it, and my father had known they wouldn't know it and had let them. And then Sol Abrams told me about the money, and I want you to understand that I had to ask him to stop twice and repeat himself because the numbers did not fit inside the picture I had of my own father. I knew my father had done well. I knew about some of the land. But I did not know the scale because my father had never shown me the full ledger, only pieces of it. The lumberyard and the house that my siblings were fighting over, the visible estate, the thing they thought they were dividing, was worth perhaps a few $100,000 all told. The real estate, the land my father had bought over 50 years, the investment portfolio he had built at his kitchen table, all of it held in a trust that Sol Abrams administered and that my siblings had never heard of and had no idea existed, was worth, Sol told me gently, watching my face, a little over $11 million. $11 million. My father, in his flannel shirts, in his 15-year-old truck, had been quietly worth $11 million, and his children had handed the failure son a box of fishing tackle and told him he'd been left nothing, and the entire $11 million, minus some specific bequests I'll tell you about, my father had left to me. I did not feel triumph when Sol Abrams told me that. I want to be honest about what I felt, because it surprised me. I felt grief, a fresh wave of it, worse than at the funeral, because in that moment I understood the full depth of how much my father had seen me, how much he had trusted me, how completely he had known my heart, and I would have traded every dollar of that $11 million for one more afternoon on the dock with him, and the money, far from feeling like a victory, felt like the last and largest thing my father ever said to me, and I would never get to say thank you. I put my face in my hands in Sol Abrams's office and I wept, and Sarah held me, and Sol Abrams, who had clearly seen a great many people react to a great many wills, sat quietly and let me, and then he said softly, "Your father told me you'd react exactly like that. He said, when you tell Eli about the money, he won't be happy about it, he'll be sad because he'll understand what it means. And Soul, that's how you'll know I chose right." And that undid me completely because even in death, even in a lawyer's office I'd never been to, my father was still there, still seeing me, still one step ahead, still proud. But my father had not simply left me the money and left it at that. My father was, to the very end, a builder, and he had built something more elaborate and more just than a simple bequest. Because along with the new will, my father had left a letter, to be read aloud by Sol Abrams, to all 4 of his children together, at a formal reading of the real will. My father had orchestrated the whole thing. He had known his other children would exclude me, mock me, divide the scraps, and he had wanted them to do exactly that, to commit fully to their contempt on the record in front of witnesses before the truth landed, so that when it landed there would be no ambiguity, no room to pretend they'd have behaved differently. My father had set a stage. He had cast his children in the roles they'd chosen for themselves their whole lives. And now, from beyond the grave, he was going to bring the curtain up on the second act, and I was to be there, and so were they, and Sol Abrams would read my father's own words to all of us at once. Sol looked at me and said, "Your father's instructions were specific. He wanted them all in one room. He wanted you there. And he wanted me to read his letter to all of you together, so that they would hear from him in his own words why he did what he did. Are you ready for that, Eli? Because once I send the notice convening this reading, there is no stopping what happens next. And here I have to tell you about the thing Preston had done, the thing that turned this from a family reckoning into something with real legal teeth, because Preston, in his arrogance, had not merely assumed there was no other will. He had gambled on it. Sol Abrams, in the careful way of a man who chooses his words, explained to me that Preston, being himself a lawyer, had moved with unusual speed to probate the old will, faster than grief alone could explain, and that in the course of settling my father's affairs Preston had certainly encountered references to Sol Abrams, to the trust, to the fact that my father's real legal and financial life was handled elsewhere, and had chosen to proceed anyway, quickly, quietly, hoping to close the estate, under the old will before anything else surfaced. Whether Preston knew for certain that a newer will existed, or merely suspected it and chose not to look too hard, Sol could not say. But either way, my brother the lawyer had rushed a superseded will through probate while there were clear signs a later one existed, and had distributed assets under it, and that was not just greedy, it was, for a licensed attorney, professional misconduct of the most serious kind, the kind that ends careers and invites investigation. Preston had been so certain that the failure brother held nothing, so certain that Dad's real affairs couldn't possibly have bypassed him, the important son, the lawyer, that he had bet his entire professional reputation on a gamble he didn't even know I could see. And I held, in a sealed envelope, the proof that he had lost that bet. If you have made it this far into my father's story, let me ask you the question I wrestled with in the days before the reading, because it was not simple and I genuinely want to know what you would have chosen. I could have handled this quietly. Sol Abrams told me I had options. I could simply enforce the real will, take the 11 million that was legally and cleanly mine, and let my siblings keep the few $100,000 of visible estate they'd already grabbed, and never expose Preston's misconduct, never make any of them face what they'd done. Just take what was mine and walk away and let the family limp on in ignorance. There was a version where I got everything that mattered and avoided all the ugliness. Or I could do what my father had actually designed, which was to convene them all, read the letter, expose the whole thing, reverse everything publicly, and let my father's own words fall on his other children like the judgment they were. The quiet path would have made me rich and spared everyone the reckoning. The other path was what my father asked for, and it would detonate the family, and it would ruin Preston, and it would force my siblings to know, in front of each other, exactly what they were. Which would you have chosen? The mercy of silence, or the justice of the truth? Tell me in the comments, because I chose my father's path and I want to tell you why, and I want to tell you whether I was right. I chose my father's path because of the letter. Sol let me read it before the reading, and my father's letter was not, as I had half feared, an act of revenge. It was an act of teaching, the last lesson of a man who had spent his life trying to teach his children things they refused to learn, and it would have been a betrayal of him to bury it. My father had not designed this to destroy his children. He had designed it to make them, finally, at last, see the truth they had spent their whole lives avoiding. The truth about who among them had substance and who had only ever had appetite, and he had understood that some lessons cannot be whispered, that some truths only land when they are undeniable and public and cannot be explained away. My father was not taking revenge on Preston and Vivian and Chase. He was giving them, one final time, the thing he had always given them and they had always squandered, which was the truth about themselves, delivered this time in a form they could not dodge. And he was giving me, at the same time, in the same act, the public vindication of a lifetime of being called the failure by people who were wrong. To bury that letter to avoid unpleasantness would have been to let the lie about me stand forever, and to let my siblings go on never knowing themselves, and my father had judged, correctly, that both of those were worse than the pain of the reckoning. So I told Sol Abrams to send the notice. And he did. The 10 days between that notice going out and the reading itself were their own kind of trial, and I want to tell you about them, because waiting when you finally hold the winning hand is a different agony than waiting when you hold nothing. Preston, of course, reacted to the notice because Preston reacts to everything. He called me. It was the first time he'd called me in years that wasn't about logistics, and his voice on the phone was doing something I'd never heard it do, which was trying to be warm. He'd realized, from Sol Abrams's name on a formal notice, that the ground under him had shifted, and he did not yet know how far, and so Preston did what Preston does when he senses danger. He tried to manage me. He suggested, oh so reasonably, that we should get ahead of whatever this is together as a family, that we shouldn't let some lawyer we don't know divide us, that he was sure we could work out anything Dad wanted between ourselves without all this formality. He was fishing, trying to find out what I knew, trying to get me into a private conversation where he could shape the outcome before it reached a room he didn't control. And I understood, listening to my brother suddenly want to be my partner after 50 years of contempt, exactly why my father had insisted on the formal reading on Sol Abrams, on the letter read aloud to all of us at once, because my father knew that if he left any crack, any private channel, any room for negotiation, Preston would climb through it and twist everything, and the truth would dissolve back into a family argument where the loudest man wins. My father had removed every crack. There was to be no private conversation. There was only the room, and the letter, and the truth spoken aloud where Preston's charm couldn't reach it. So I told Preston, calmly, that I thought we should just do what Dad's lawyer had asked, and let the reading happen and hear what Dad wanted from Dad. And I hung up and I sat with how badly I had wanted, for 50 years, for Preston to want to be close to me, and how it had taken the smell of lost money to finally make him try, and how that was the saddest confirmation of all. Sarah found me at the kitchen table after that call, and she put her hand on my shoulder, and she said the thing that got me through those 10 days. She said, "You don't have to win, Eli. Your dad already won it for you. All you have to do is show up and let him." And that was exactly right, and it was exactly what my father had built. A victory I didn't have to fight for, only to be present for, because he had done all the fighting in advance, out of love, from a dock 2 hours north, 2 years before he died. The reading of the reel will took place 10 days later, in a conference room in Sol Abrams's modest offices, and I want to describe it to you carefully, because it was the strangest and most powerful hour of my life, the hour my father reached out of his grave and set his house in order. My siblings came because they had to. A formal notice from an attorney they'd never heard of, convening a reading of a will, is not a thing even Preston could ignore, though I am sure he tried to find a way. They arrived confused and irritated and, in Preston's case, visibly wary because Preston was a lawyer and Preston understood, the moment he saw Sol Abrams's name on a formal notice, that something was wrong with his tidy assumptions. They filed into that conference room, Preston and Vivian and Chase, and they saw me already sitting there beside Sol Abrams, and I watched the confusion cross their faces, the failure brother, seated at the right hand of a lawyer, at a reading none of them understood. Preston recovered first and went on the offensive, as he always does, demanding to know what this was, who this lawyer was, why I was there, saying he'd already settled the estate, that the will had been read, that this was some kind of stunt. And Sol Abrams let him talk, the way my father used to let people talk, and when Preston had finished, Sol Abrams said quietly, "Mr. Sutton, please sit down. My name is Sol Abrams. I was your father's attorney for the last several years of his life, for matters he chose to keep separate from his affairs in Ashford. The will that was read 3 days after your father's funeral was revoked by your father over 2 years ago. I am the custodian of his actual last will and testament, properly executed and witnessed, which supersedes all prior wills. And before I read it to you, your father asked me to read you a letter. I'd suggest you save your questions until after you've heard your father's own words. Please, sit. I have never in my life seen my brother Preston go pale, but he went pale then because Preston, alone among my siblings, understood in that instant the full dimension of what was happening, understood that he had probated a dead will, understood that a later will existed, understood that he, an attorney, had exposed himself catastrophically, and understood that the failure brother had known all along. Vivian looked confused and beginning to be frightened. Chase just looked lost, the way Chase has looked his whole life. And they sat because there was nothing else to do, and Sol Abrams put on his glasses, and he took out my father's letter, and in that quiet room he began to read my father's voice back to us. All four of us, one last time. My father's letter began gently. To my children, all four of you together, which is the only way I could make sure you'd hear this. If Sol is reading you this, then I'm gone, and enough time has passed for you to have shown your true colors. And I'm sorry to say I wrote this letter because I already knew what those colors were. I love all four of you. I need you to know that first because what comes next is hard, and I don't want you to mistake honesty for a lack of love. I have watched all of you your whole lives. And somewhere along the way, three of you decided that the measure of a person is what they acquire, how important they look, how far they got from Ashford and from me. And one of you never believed that at all. My father's letter went on, and it named things, gently but unmistakably. It named the 8 years I visited and they didn't. It named the phone calls unreturned, the visits that were really inspections, the way they had treated the town and the lumberyard and their own father as things to be slightly ashamed of. It named, without cruelty but without mercy either, the exact character of each of his children. And it was the more devastating for how calm it was, how sorrowful, how much it was the voice of a man who had hoped, for decades, to be proven wrong and had not been. I watched my siblings' faces as Sol Abrams read, and the three of them received our father's truth in three different ways. Exactly the three ways their three characters had always predicted. Preston's face closed like a fist. He did not absorb a word of it as truth. I could see him instead cataloging it as a legal problem, as evidence of diminished capacity or estrangement he might use. His mind already in the courtroom, already fighting, and the more devastating our father's words, the more Preston retreated into strategy, because to actually let those words land would have required Preston to feel something true about himself. And Preston had spent 50 years building a life, specifically designed to never have to do that. Vivian began to come apart. I watched my sister's carefully composed face crack, watched the mask she'd worn for 20 years slip, and behind it was something I hadn't seen since we were children. Something raw and ashamed and awake, because Vivian, unlike Preston, was still capable of hearing the truth, and it was reaching her. Our father's sorrowful voice describing exactly the woman she'd made herself into, and it was landing like blows she couldn't block. And Chase simply crumpled quietly, his head going down, his shoulders starting to shake, because Chase had always known, in the cowardly recesses where he kept the things he didn't want to look at, that he'd betrayed the brother who'd been good to him, and now his father's voice was saying it out loud, gently, and there was nowhere left for Chase to hide from it. Three siblings, three faces, three different collisions with a truth they'd spent their whole lives avoiding, and our father, from beyond the grave, had arranged for all three collisions to happen at once, in the same room, so that none of them could ever again pretend the truth hadn't been spoken. And then my father's letter turned to me, and I had to grip the arms of my chair to get through it. And I am not ashamed to tell you I wept openly in that conference room while a lawyer read my dead father's words, because my father wrote. And then there is Eli, the one you all decided was the failure, the one who stayed. I need the three of you to hear this because you never understood it, and it is the truest thing I know. Eli is the only one of my 4 children who ever loved me for myself and not for what I had. He is the only one who came when there was nothing to gain by coming. He stayed in Ashford not because he lacked the ambition to leave, but because he had the wisdom to know that a life close to the people you love, doing honest work with your hands, is not a lesser life. It is very nearly the only kind of life worth having, and it took me 70 years to understand what my son understood at 20. You called him the failure. He was the only success I ever actually raised. The rest of you I gave every advantage. and you turned into people who would read your father's will 3 days after his funeral and hand your grieving brother a box of fishing tackle. Eli, I gave nothing but my time, and my time turned out to be the only inheritance that mattered, and he is the only one who ever wanted it." The room was silent. I was weeping. Vivian had begun to cry. Chase was staring at the table. And Preston sat rigid, his face a mask, because Preston understood what was still coming, the part that was not about character but about money and law. And Sol Abrams turned to the will itself and read it. "And my father's real will left the lumberyard, restructured to protect the jobs of the men who'd worked there for decades, in a trust to be overseen by me. It left the house I grew up in to me. It left specific, generous bequests to charities in Ashford and a scholarship fund in my mother Carol's name. It left a modest, dignified sum to each of my 3 siblings, enough to be fair, enough that no one could say he disinherited them out of spite, but not the fortune they'd imagined, and my father's letter explained even that, explained that he was leaving them something rather than nothing precisely, so that they could not tell themselves the story that he'd been cruel, so that they would have to sit with the harder truth that he had simply, clearly, weighed each of his children and made an honest judgment. And the bulk of the estate, the land, the portfolio, the 11 million my father had built in flannel shirts while his children were embarrassed by him, my father left to me, his son Eli, the failure, the one who stayed, with a final line in the will that I will carry to my own grave. To my son Eli, who never asked for any of it, I leave nearly all of it, because he is the only one who was ever rich in the way that counts, and I trust him to do more good with it than his brothers and sister would have done with themselves." And then Sol Abrams took off his glasses, and the reading was over, and the reversal was complete, and my father, from beyond the grave, had set every crooked thing in that family straight in the space of 1 hour. What happened in the minutes after that reading told me everything about my 3 siblings, more even than the years before had, because there is nothing like the loss of a fortune they'd already counted as theirs to show you what people are made of. Preston went, almost immediately, from pale silence to cold fury, and the fury was not about grief and it was not about our father. It was about himself, about his exposure, about the catastrophe he now faced. Because Preston understood, faster than anyone, that he had a problem far larger than a smaller inheritance. He had, as a licensed attorney, rushed a revoked will through probate while there were signs of a later one, and distributed assets under it, and now the later will had surfaced and everything he had done had to be unwound, and the question of what he had known and when he had known it was a question that could follow him to the Bar Association and beyond. Preston's first words after our father's letter, the letter that had just laid his soul bare in front of his whole family, were not about our father at all. They were, "This will be challenged. This is clearly the product of undue influence. Eli isolated him and manipulated a sick old man." He said it in front of me, in front of Sol Abrams, over the echo of our father's voice telling him who he was, and I understood that Preston had heard none of it, that Preston was incapable of hearing it, that Preston had already skipped past the truth about himself and gone straight to strategy, to how to fight it, to how to take from me what our father had freely given. That was Preston. Even then, even there. But Preston's threat was empty, and Sol Abrams, who had prepared for exactly this because my father had told him Preston would say exactly this, dismantled it in about 4 sentences. The will was ironclad. My father had made it 2 years before his death, when he was indisputably sharp, and Sol had taken the precaution, at my father's instruction, of having my father's competence documented at the time of signing, and of recording my father's own statement of his reasons, precisely so that no one could later claim the failure son had manipulated a dying man. My father had anticipated Preston's exact move and had spent 2 years building the wall against it. And Sol Abrams looked at Preston, this small sharp old lawyer looking at my arrogant brother, and he said, "Mr. Sutton, I would advise you, as one attorney to another, to think very carefully before you challenge this will in court, because a challenge will require discovery. And discovery will require a full and public examination of exactly how and why you came to probate a revoked will so quickly, and what you knew about your father's other affairs when you did it. I have your father's complete file. I don't think a courtroom is where you want this to go. I think you know that better than I do." And I watched my brother, the lawyer, understand that he had been beaten not by the failure but by our father, who had outlawyered the lawyer from beyond the grave, and that his only move now was to retreat and hope the whole thing stayed quiet. It did not entirely stay quiet, and Preston's fall, when it came from his own choices, as these things always do. The estate had to be unwound and reprobated under the real will, and that process made the facts a matter of record. And in a profession as small and reputation dependent as the law, the story of an attorney who rushed his own father's revoked will through probate and got caught when the real one surfaced did not stay secret for long. Preston was not disbarred in the end. It did not rise quite to that. But his reputation, the thing Preston valued above all others, the thing he had traded his whole family for, took a wound it would never fully recover from, because in his world, the world of important people who valued achievement exactly as my father's letter had said, the whisper that a man had tried to cheat his own family out of an inheritance and been caught is the kind of whisper that follows you into every room for the rest of your career. Preston, who had spent his life escaping the shame of the lumberyard and the flannel, ended up marked by a far worse shame entirely of his own making. And he did it to himself, and I did not have to lift a hand. The town found out, the way towns do, and the town's reaction taught me something about where I'd actually been standing all those years I thought I was standing at the bottom. Because when the story worked its way through Ashford, that Gordon Sutton had quietly been worth a fortune, and that he'd left it to Eli, the carpenter, the one who stayed, and that the city siblings had tried to divide it behind his back and been caught, the people of my town were not surprised, not in the way you'd think. The lumberyard men, the neighbors, the fishing buddies, the people who had actually known my father and actually knew me, they nodded, and more than one of them said some version of the same thing to me, which was, "Course he left it to you, Eli. You're the one who was there." Everybody in this town knew that but them. And I realized slowly that the family verdict I'd carried for 50 years, the verdict that I was the failure, had only ever been the verdict of 3 people who lived 200 miles away and had decided the matter without evidence. The people who actually watched me live my life, who saw me take care of my father and build honest things and stay rooted where I was planted, had never once thought I was a failure. I had let 3 distant voices outweigh a whole town of people who saw me clearly, because the 3 voices were family, and family's judgment burrows deeper than it has any right to. It took my father's death and his letter to make me finally understand that I had been surrounded, the whole time, by people who knew exactly what I was worth, and that the only place I'd ever been the failure was in the eyes of the 3 people least qualified to judge, and in the shadow those 3 had cast across my own view of myself. Losing that shadow was worth more than the 11 million. I mean that as literally as I have ever meant anything. Vivian's reckoning was quieter and, I think in the long run, more real. My sister had cried during the letter, and I had not been able to tell, at the time, whether the tears were shame or self-pity, and for a while afterward I assumed the worst. But something in that letter reached Vivian in a way it never reached Preston. Some months later she called me, the first real conversation we'd had in 20 years, and she did not ask for money, and she did not make excuses. She just said, in a small voice I hadn't heard since we were children, "He was right about me, wasn't he, Dad? Everything he said. I made myself into someone he was ashamed of." And I did not lie to her, because our father's whole point had been the end of comfortable lies. But I did not twist the knife either, because I am not Preston, and I said, "He wasn't ashamed of you, Viv. He was sad about you. There's a difference. And it's not too late to be someone he'd have been proud of. He left you enough to build a different life. Maybe that was the point of leaving you anything at all." And there was a long silence on the phone, and then my sister said thank you, and she meant it, and we have talked since more than we did in the 2 decades before, and she is slowly becoming someone I think our father would recognize. That is not nothing. Sometimes the truth, even when it costs you a fortune, is the thing that finally sets a person free, and I believe it set Vivian free, or began to. And Chase, my younger brother Chase, the drifter, the follower, the one who had gone along with Preston his whole life because Chase never had a spine of his own. Chase surprised me most of all, because a week after the reading, Chase showed up at my house in Ashford, unannounced, and he stood on my porch and he could barely look at me, and he said, "Eli, I helped them read that will without you. I sat there and I let Preston hand you that box and I said nothing. And I've been sick about it every day since, even before I knew about any of this. Even when I thought I was getting money out of it, I was sick about it, because you're my brother and you were always good to me, and I treated you like Preston told me to my whole life because it was easier than thinking for myself." And Chase started to cry, on my porch, a grown man, and he said, "I don't want the money Dad left me. I don't deserve it. I just want to know if there's any way you can forgive me for being a coward." And I looked at my little brother and I thought about our father's letter, and I understood that this was the moment the whole thing had really been for, Not the reversal, not Preston's fall, but this, a person actually changed by the truth, actually reaching for something better. And I told Chase to keep the money because Dad left it to him on purpose and it would dishonor Dad to refuse it, but to use it to build a life he wasn't ashamed of, and I told him there was nothing to forgive, that he'd been a frightened man in a family that ran on Preston's contempt, and that the fact that he'd come to my porch and said these words put him miles ahead of where any of us had been. And then I did the thing our father would have done. I asked Chase if he wanted to go fishing, and he said yes. And the two of us drove 2 hours north to our father's cabin, and we sat on the dock where Dad had handed me the envelope, and we fished, and we didn't catch anything, which is most of what fishing is, and we talked, really talked, for the first time in our lives, two brothers finding each other on the water our father loved. Chase and I are close now. He moved back to Ashford. He works with me sometimes. Our father got that, at least, from all of this, one son coming home. I like to think he knows. I went to my father alone once after all of it had settled, the way I used to go to him every week when he was alive. He's buried next to my mother in the little cemetery on the hill above Ashford, where you can see the town and, on a clear day, the green edge of the land he spent 50 years quietly buying. And I sat down in the grass by his stone, the way I used to sit on the dock beside him, and I told him everything. I told him I'd kept my promise, that I'd said nothing, that I'd let them show me who they were, that I'd taken the envelope to Seoul like he asked and not a day before. I told him about the reading, about Preston's face and Vivian's tears and Chase on my porch. I told him I'd saved the lumberyard and the men's jobs and started Mom's scholarship, and that a kid from Ashford was already going to college because of her. And I told him the thing I'd driven up there to say, the thing I never got to say while he was alive because I never knew until Sol Abrams told me how completely he'd seen me. I said, "Thank you for knowing who I was, Dad. My whole life everybody told me I was the one who didn't count, and I half believed them, and you knew the whole time and you found a way to tell me even after you were gone. I'm sorry I never got to hear you say it out loud, but I heard it. Sol read it to a whole room just like you wanted. I heard it. And I sat there in the grass a long while, the way we used to sit on the dock and not catch anything, and the wind moved through the grass, and I swear to you I felt him there, the way I'd felt his hand squeeze mine at the very end. And for the first time since he died, I was not sad. I was just grateful. Grateful to have been the son of a man who understood that character is a reason and blood is not, and who loved me enough to spend the last 2 years of his life making sure the truth about me would outlive the lie. Not every son gets that. I know I was lucky. I know it every single day. Now let me tell you what I did with the money, because it is the last part of the lesson my father was teaching, and it is the part that matters most, and it is the reason I know he chose right. I did not become a different man. That was the first thing and the most important. I had spent my whole life being told I was the failure for wanting a small, honest life in Ashford, doing work with my hands, close to the people I love, and the $11 million did not suddenly reveal that my siblings had been right, that the point of life was to acquire and to climb and to leave. It revealed the opposite, because my father had not left me that fortune so that I would finally go become a Preston. He had left it to me precisely because he trusted that I would understand money the way he had, as a tool and a responsibility and not as a scoreboard. So I kept building cabinets. I kept my small, honest life. I did not buy a mansion or a fast car or a new identity. What I did instead was use my father's fortune the way my father would have wanted it used, quietly, patiently, to do good in the town that made us. I saved the lumberyard and the jobs of the men who'd worked there for decades, some of them since before I was born. I funded the scholarship in my mother's name so that kids from Ashford who couldn't afford it could go to college, and I have watched, in the years since, a dozen young people from my small forgotten town get educations they could never have had, and every one of them is a monument to a woman named Carol Sutton who most of them never met. I fixed up the town, quietly, the way my father used to do things, an anonymous donation here, a paid-off medical bill there, a struggling family's mortgage handled by a benefactor they never identified. My father made his fortune invisibly. I decided to spend it the same way. And I kept the fishing cabin exactly as it was, and I take my son there now, and I will hand him an envelope of my own someday, though I hope its contents will be simpler than my father's had to be. My name is Eli Sutton. I want to tell you what I learned, and it is the only thing I have to give you at the end of all this. If your family has decided that you are the failure, the disappointment, the one who doesn't count, I want you to hear something from a man who wore that label for 50 years before the truth finally came out. The people who measure you by what you acquire are telling you far more about themselves than about you. My brother and sister looked at my small life in Ashford, my work boots and my sawdust and my modest house, and they saw failure because acquisition and status were the only lenses they had, and a man who chose love and presence and honest work over climbing was, to them, incomprehensible, and so they filed me under failure and never looked again. But my father, who had actually built the fortune they all assumed made him important, looked at the very same small life and saw the only success he'd ever raised. Two people looked at me and saw opposite things, and the difference between them was not me. The difference was what they valued. And here is what took me 50 years to understand. You do not have to accept the verdict of the people who are measuring with the wrong ruler. Their contempt is not information about your worth. It is information about their values. Let them keep it. And here is the second thing, the harder thing, the thing my father knew and built his whole quiet strategy around. The people who love you for what you have will show you exactly who they are the moment you no longer have anything to give them, and the people who love you for yourself will be there when there is nothing in it for them at all. My father spent his last years quietly watching which of his children came when there was nothing to gain, and he built his entire will around the answer, and he was right, and the reading of that will was really just my father holding up a mirror to each of us and showing us who we'd chosen to become. If you want to know who your real family is, watch who shows up when you have nothing to offer. Watch who calls when you're not useful. Watch who sits with you when you're dying, and who's already going through the drawers. My father knew. He knew for years. And he arranged things so that his children would know too, at last, in a form none of us could deny. The last thing is this, and it is the thing I most want you to carry out of an old carpenter's story. My father could have just left me the money quietly and spared everyone the reckoning. But he understood that some truths have to be spoken out loud, in the open, undeniably, or they never do their work. For 50 years I was the family failure, and if my father had simply slipped me the inheritance in private, I would have been a rich failure, and the lie about who I was would have stood forever in my siblings' minds and, worse, in the quiet corners of my own. My father did not just leave me his fortune. He left me the truth, spoken aloud, in front of the very people who had spent my life telling me the lie, so that the lie could finally die. That was the real inheritance. Not the 11 million. The words. He was the only success I ever actually raised. A man can live his whole life on a sentence like that from his father, and I intend to. So if you are the overlooked one, the failure in your family's eyes, the one seated at the far end of every table, I want you to know that somewhere, maybe, someone sees you clearly the way my father saw me, and even if they never say it out loud in life, the seeing is real and it matters, and you are so often not the failure at all. You are just the one being measured with the wrong ruler by people who never learned there was any other kind. So let me leave you with the question I have carried since that reading, and let me ask it plainly. If your family cut you out, mocked you, handed you a box of scraps and told you that the person who loved you had judged you worthless, and you discovered that you actually held the truth and the fortune all along, what would you do? Would you take it quietly and walk away, sparing them the reckoning? Or would you let the truth be spoken out loud, in front of everyone, whatever it cost and whatever it broke? Tell me in the comments. And tell me, too, if your family ever decided you were the failure, because I promise you that someone listening to this right now is carrying that exact label tonight, wearing it like a wet coat, and they need to hear from you that the verdict of the people measuring with the wrong ruler is not the truth about who they are. My father handed me a box of fishing tackle through my brother's contempt, and hidden under the tray was a letter that gave me back my whole life. The people who love you for what you have will always underestimate the people who were only ever rich in the way that counts. Be rich in the way that counts. In the end, it is the only inheritance that visits you, the only one that cannot be read without you, and the only one that was ever really worth having. My name is Eli Sutton. They read the will without me, and handed me a box of my father's old fishing tackle, and told me our father had left me nothing. And they were wrong, the way they had been wrong about me my whole life, because my father had left me everything that mattered, hidden exactly where their contempt would keep them from ever looking. If your family has written you off as the one who doesn't count, stop listening to an old carpenter's story now, and go be rich in the way that counts, and trust that somewhere someone saw you, and wait, if you have to, for the truth to arrive. It's patient. It kept for 2 years under a tray of fishing lures. It will keep for you too. Say the thing while you can to the people who show up. And never, Ever let someone measuring with the wrong ruler tell you the size of your worth?